Good evening. My name is John White, and I'm on the faculty here. And on behalf of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Harvard Republican Club and the Kennedy School Republican Caucus, the Kennedy School International Security Caucus, and the Institute of Politics, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here for this event tonight. Our guest tonight, Douglas Feith, is the current Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, one of the most senior presidential appointees in the Department of Defense. His responsibilities include the formulation of defense guidance and force planning, DoD's relations with foreign countries, and the department's role in all U.S. government interagency policy making. I can assure you from my own experience in the Pentagon and in the White House, this is one of the most stressful, challenging jobs in town. Before his appointment, Doug was the managing partner of the Washington firm of Feith and Zell. His prior government experience includes serving as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the negotiations policy from '84 to '86. He has written extensively on international law as well as on foreign and defense policy. He holds a law degree from Georgetown and an AB from the college. And before I turn the rostrum, I want to introduce also his family is here. Dan is here, his son, who is a junior at the college, welcome. And his daughter, welcome. We're nice to have this. We like to have family events here, so we're very pleased with this. We're pleased you're here. Before I turn the rostrum over, I want to remind you a little bit of the format of these forum events for those of you who may not have been here before. The Undersecretary will speak for about 25 minutes on the subject of civil liberties, civil society, and civility. And then for roughly 30 minutes, I will moderate a question and answer session with the audience. Now, we recognize that there are many strong passions about policies that have to do, obviously, with defense and war and peace. And during the question and answer session, you will be encouraged and invited to ask any appropriate question that you would like to ask of the Undersecretary. But we would ask you at the same time, obviously, to show him the courtesy as our guest, to allow him to make his initial remarks and make those remarks uninterrupted. So with that, let me welcome you, Doug. We're pleased to have you here. Thank you.
Good evening. It's good to be back at Harvard. As Secretary White noted, I went to school here at the college. I want to reassure the students in the audience, a Harvard degree does not have to be a liability. In conservative political circles, I've found it may require some explaining, but many conservatives are open-minded and others are forgiving. As an example of this generosity of spirit, I'll tell you a true story. Nearly 30 years ago, I had a piece of foreign policy juvenilia published in the journal of a conservative think tank. The biographical squib mentioned my recent college degree. A reader sent me a fan letter asserting as a compliment that I must have slept through my classes at Harvard to have written so sensible an article. So much for right-wing humor. Actually, I stayed rather attentive in my government classes in college, without much ill effect. As it happens, some of what I read in a Gov course on political philosophy has had some bearing on work that I've done at the Pentagon, some of which I'll discuss this evening. Two concepts I studied here are particularly relevant to the U.S. strategy in the war on terrorism. The first is civil liberties and how to think about the balance between individual freedom and the powers of government. The second is the local character of governmental institutions and whether they measure up to principles that are said to be universal. In the United States, national security refers to more than protecting territory or people. The United States is not just a country. It's a country that lives in a certain way. The word American proclaims not an ethnic identity, but an association with a community regulated by our Constitution. That's why, though one cannot instantly change one's ethnicity, millions of people have, by taking an oath, become not just American citizens, but Americans. All of this is to say that civil liberties are not just a feature of life here, they are what defines us as a nation. The civil liberties of the American people, therefore, are what we aim to secure when we work on national security policy. Part of my education here at Harvard was reading John Stuart Mill, who championed the ethical and practical benefits of liberal principles, principles that respect the worth of individuals and the equality of individuals under the law. In his writings, including his 1859 essay on liberty, Mill argued that humane and sensible societies allow their people as much individual freedom as is consistent with self-protection or public safety. Much of what makes Americans happy, their political freedom, economic prosperity, domestic tranquility, and opportunity to better themselves, derives from the liberal and democratic nature of our society and the degree of mutual trust, sometimes referred to as social capital, that such a society engenders. It's hard to overstate the moral and material benefits that are rooted in that social capital, in that trust, in our freedom. This, we should all appreciate, is what's at stake in the war on terrorism. Beyond the cost in lives and property, the 9/11 attack, or rather our reaction to it, exposed a far-reaching element of the threat posed by terrorism. To protect ourselves physically, we might feel compelled to change fundamentally the way we live, sacrificing our society's openness for hoped-for security. Because of our historical good fortune, we Americans enjoyed for a long time a high degree of public safety, and so became accustomed to thinking that the liberal openness of our way of life is not only sacred, but immutable. But a community's freedom depends on circumstances. Societies inevitably adjust to allow the state to fulfill its most basic duty, providing security. As noted, even such uncompromising champions of liberty as Mill bowed to the exigencies of public safety. Our Constitution, and the judges that interpret it, often seem to be saying that our freedoms are absolute. But when danger becomes oppressive, people are wont to recall the quip that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, concerned that another attack may be in the works, our government took actions to eliminate vulnerabilities that the hijackers had turned to their advantage. We shut down air travel throughout the US. When it resumed, we intensified airport security measures, and folks now have to remember to wear duly mended socks when they plan to fly. At the same time, the government restricted the issuance of visas, thus affecting not only the freedom of foreigners to travel, but the freedom of Americans to host them. And new legislation allowed intelligence and law enforcement agencies to share information more readily. These were steps deemed prudent, indeed necessary, in the light of what we knew and didn't know at the time. My interest here is not to defend particular measures. Rather, it's to stress that beyond the human and material costs it imposes, terrorism takes advantage of and thereby endangers the openness and trust that allow us to enjoy freedom and prosperity. If another 9/11 happened, especially an attack involving the use of nuclear or biological weapons. Who could doubt that our society would respond by increasing further the powers of government, affecting our freedoms? As has happened over and over again for the last 35 years or so, since the era of airplane hijacking got into full swing, security measures that once seemed outrageous could over time become routine. Such thoughts weighed on President Bush and his advisors as they considered in the period immediately after 9/11 how to prevent the next attack against the United States. If the strategy for preventing that attack were to be solely or even primarily defensive, it would require a wholesale clamping down, not just at our borders, but throughout the country. President Bush early on recognized that 9/11 was an act of war, not merely a law enforcement matter, and that the enemy is not a single group, but a network of extremists and their state and non-state supporters. The president declared that our war aim is to defeat terrorism as a threat to our way of life as a free and open society. We could not achieve that aim, for we could not maintain a free and open society with a solely defensive strategy. To preserve civil liberties, the president had to adopt a strategy of disrupting terrorist networks abroad, where they do much of their planning, recruiting, and training. He had to adopt a strategy of initiative and offense. I put it this way. The president decided that in dealing with the terrorists, he had either to change the way we live or change the way they live. Taking the war to the enemy has been necessary but not sufficient. Many months ago, in one of his famous snowflake memoranda, which leaked to a newspaper, Secretary Rumsfeld asked, "Are we capturing or killing terrorists faster than our enemies can recruit new terrorists?" Now, the Secretary knows that attacking enemy networks keeps the terrorists off balance and can deprive them of what they need to operate. What the Secretary wanted to highlight was that such action cannot produce victory in the wars so long as those networks can regenerate themselves. To defeat our enemies in this war, we'll have to do more than disrupt and attack. We'll have to counter their ideology. It's the attractiveness of extremist ideology to certain segments of the Muslim world that motivates people to join and help the terrorist groups. As the 9/11 Commission noted, the U.S. aim, in addition to attacking the terrorist groups, should be to prevail in the longer term over the ideology that gives rise to Islamist terrorism. The first part of this battle of ideas is the effort to delegitimate terrorism. The purposeful targeting of ordinary people going about their lives in offices, markets, and such places is not a political method that deserves credit or pardon from decent people. This is what President Bush is driving at when he says that U.S. policy aims to make terrorism like the slave trade, piracy, or genocide, activities that nobody who aspires to respectability can condone, much less support. It's an ambitious goal to change the way millions of people think, but it can be done. History yields examples of successful ideological campaigns. Particularly noteworthy, in my view, is Britain's effort in the 19th century to suppress the international slave trade. It was a protracted, multifaceted, far-flung enterprise. The British Navy had a leading role, as did the church. Journalists, diplomats, and university figures all worked for the cause. The effort took more than 50 years, succeeding ultimately not only in suppressing to a large extent that sad commerce, but in delegitimating it. At the end of the 19th century, the civilized world didn't justify or excuse the slave trade as had commonly been done when the century began. the British effort changed the way millions of people thought, talked, and acted. Britain's fight against the slave trade involved, in today's phrase, all instruments of national power. It used hard, that is military power, and soft. It tapped the energies of the government and of society at large. Similarly, non-governmental institutions today, universities, think tanks, other NGOs, have a role to play in the ideological struggle against terrorism. Such institutions can, in various ways, wage the battle of ideas in the war on terrorism more effectively than can our government. Government policymakers have the task of finding proper and effective means to encourage that effort. Delegitimating terrorism is but one component of the strategy to counter ideological support for our extremist enemies. President Bush, in recent speeches, has been emphasizing another: promotion of civil society, political freedom, and self-government. As he said in his second inaugural address, the survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world. America's vital interests and our deepest beliefs are now one. Close quote. This has produced controversy. I'll deal here with two lines of criticism that I find particularly interesting. One is that the president is too ambitious in that he should not expect to be able to implant democracy in what is said to be unfertile soil. The other is that the president is not ambitious enough in pressing certain countries to implement principles of liberal democracy. The first line of criticism, that he's too sanguine about promoting democracy, might be labeled Burkean, as in Edmund Burke, one of the philosophers to whom I was introduced here at Harvard. In college and since, I read and reread Burke with admiration and profit. He teaches that successful political institutions are rooted in local soil. They grow organically, as it were, out of the culture, situation, and historical experience of particular people. Burke warns of the catastrophes that can result from arrogant rationalists using philosophical abstractions for the revolutionary remaking of societies. Burke's arguments have power not only because they're elegantly articulated, but because they were vindicated so bloodily in the French Revolution, in the course of which he wrote some of his greatest work, and then vindicated again repeatedly over the next 2 centuries in the Bolshevik Revolution and in other murderous projects of grand social engineering. If the test of a theory is that it predicts, then Burke's writings deserve high grades and careful consideration. I see President Bush's promotion of human freedom not as arrogance or naive and rampant Wilsonianism. The president starts, I believe, from the well-grounded observation that societies with free political institutions provide their people with greater personal liberty and prosperity than do societies without such institutions. He observes that the rejection of tyranny and the aspiration for freedom are not peculiar to our particular culture. As he said in his second inaugural, America will not pretend that jailed dissidents prefer their chains, or that women welcome humiliation and servitude, or that any human being aspires to live at the mercy of bullies. At the same time, the president has made a point of not urging, let alone imposing, American-style political institutions on other countries. He doesn't believe that there's a single model of democratic governance that can function everywhere. Actually, he has said the opposite. I quote, "As we watch and encourage reforms in the Middle East, we are mindful that modernization is not the same as Westernization. Representative governments in the Middle East will reflect their own cultures. They will not and should not look like us." The president, I submit, is here voicing the modest prudence of Burkean restraint. So we come to the second line of criticism. Not that the administration is trying to impose our ideas of democracy on unwilling or unready Afghans or Iraqis, but rather the opposite, that the administration is tolerating political institutions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere that don't count as democratic because they don't measure up to American standards. The critics here commonly focus on the new Afghan constitution and Iraq's interim constitution, which is known as the Transitional Administrative Law. Both refer to Islam as the state religion. Neither document, to be sure, would pass muster by US constitutional law standards. But are these freshly produced constitutions, therefore, undemocratic? Both documents state protections for rights of non-Muslims. The Afghan constitution says that followers of other religions, other than Islam, are free to perform their religious rites within the limits of the provisions of law, and that the Afghan state shall abide by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Iraqi interim constitution painstakingly balances Islam's official status with the rights of non-Muslims. I quote, "Islam is the official religion of the state and is to be considered a source of legislation. No law may contradict the universally agreed tenets of Islam, the principles of democracy, or the individual rights cited in the interim constitution. The interim constitution guarantees the full religious rights of all individuals to freedom of religious belief and practice." Close quote. Among the individual rights referred to here are those in the following provision. Each Iraqi has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religious belief and practice. Coercion in such matters shall be prohibited. Close quote. Are such provisions incompatible with a decent political order, with human freedom, or with democracy? Before we answer, we should consider the rather wide spectrum of liberality across which are ranged the world's democratic countries. The more individualist democracies, generally the countries of new settlement, are on the liberal side of the spectrum. On the other are those democracies, generally countries with national histories that reach back into antiquity, that are comfortable giving legal recognition to religious or ethnic groups. In some countries, democracy might not be workable if it were not possible to take into account the interests of these groups as groups, however un-American that concept is. As illiberal as it is to give groups as groups legal rights and privileges, it has been deemed necessary in some democratic countries where historical experience has made it impossible for members of various groups to relate to each other simply as fellow citizens. Now, on this spectrum of democracies, the United States is ensconced at the liberal end. We pride ourselves on laws that respect the liberty and political equality of individual citizens. Our political institutions, the US Senate and the Electoral College being notable anomalies, stand on the principle of one man, one vote. We have no king and no established church. And our Constitution, since the Civil War in principle and since the Civil Rights Movement in fact, disallows invidious recognition of race, religion, or ethnic identity. But, as I've noted, fundamental as these features are to the American political system, they are by no means universal among the world's democracies. The heads of state of such venerable democratic countries as Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom are hereditary monarchs. The UK and Denmark have established churches. In a number of democracies, such as France and Germany, the state pays clerics. Many democracies have religious symbols on their flags. For example, Switzerland and Norway each have a cross. On the UK flag, there are 2 crosses. Even in liberal and tolerant Canada, There are laws concerning the font sizes in which storefront signs must announce their wares in French and in other languages. And democracies differ from one another also regarding other matters of civil liberties. British libel laws are much stricter than those in the United States. Germany and France make the uttering of certain opinions, for example, denial of the Holocaust, a criminal offense. Such laws would be regarded in the United States as violations of freedom of speech. Finally, police search powers differ widely among democratic states. Many European states give their police powers that would, in the United States, be regarded as unreasonable infringements on privacy. Given the variety of political institutions, even among the advanced industrial democracies of the West, no one should be surprised if and when new democracies in other parts of the world emerge looking quite different from our own. As more and more societies achieve self-government, they will evolve institutions and practices that fit their own cultures and circumstances. One of the impressive things about the Afghan and Iraqi constitutions I've been discussing is that they were created through democratic debate, not dictatorial fiat. Indeed, orderly, reasoned, and respectful debate of controversial subjects is crucial for the functioning of democratic government. It may even have a place at American universities. As you've heard, I'm a fan of Edmund Burke. At the end of his reflections on the revolution in France, he claims that he is someone in whose breast no anger durable or vehement has ever been kindled, but by what he considered as tyranny. This strikes me as a kind of gold standard for those who would enter the public debate in a democracy. In a similar vein, J.S. Mill, though hardly an ally of Burke on most issues, notes, with respect to democratic debate, the worst offense which can be committed by a polemic is to stigmatize those who hold the contrary opinion as bad and immoral men. Indeed, as Mill points out, in the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? Because he has kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and conduct. Because it has been his practice to listen to all that could be said against him, to profit by as much as was just, and to expound to himself, and upon occasion to others, the fallacy of what was fallacious. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, democratic debate is in its infancy. We hope that tolerance and compromise will become habitual there and make possible, though the process will likely be long and tumultuous, the creation of prosperous democratic societies. We may even be seeing early signs that political progress in those countries is having benign influence on others in the region, including the Palestinians and the Lebanese. This has been an exciting time to be in government and to witness, encourage, and perhaps help enable the blossoming of humane ideas of liberty and self-government, the exposition of which one had the good fortune not to sleep through many years earlier in a Harvard classroom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because of what you did.
Thank you.
Because of what you did.
Thank you. We'll now have the questions. We now have time for some questions, and I would ask you please to identify yourself and to state your question simply. And there's one question per person, and a good question is short and ends in a question mark. We'll start over here.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Aaron Mowry. I am a freshman at Harvard College. We have seen democracy taking root all over in the Middle East in recent months, notably with the elections in Iraq and commitments to democracy in Egypt, Lebanon, and Palestine. How do you see this process continuing, and what will the United States' role be in advancing democratic movements in the Middle East and throughout the world?
I think that the happy events that you've cited in these various places are early buds, and there's clearly a long way to go for various countries throughout the Middle East to have developed stable democratic institutions. And I would stress that democracy is a lot more than elections. And the institutions that are foundation stones for democracy, things like multiple centers of power and an independent judiciary and private property and a free press, and perhaps most importantly, a culture of compromise, a movement away from the kind of primitive winner-take-all politics that exists in so many countries and has existed in some of the places that you've cited there for a long time. Those institutions take time. And so I want to be as pleased as I am with a number of these developments, and as exciting as these developments are, I think we need to approach them soberly. I think they are very good signs. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to be done to get these institutions really up and running. These many institutions other than just elections. And what the United States does to encourage it or to help it along, as your question was, is a number of things. I think, first of all, what the president has said about freedom, about democracy, has had an effect on people's attitudes in the area. And the willingness of the Lebanese people to step forward quite bravely under difficult circumstances is partly a reflection of the new talk of the new talk that's been done about how important these things are. And so I think that there's a lot that can be done by encouraging. There's a lot that can be done by technical kinds of assistance that we give to democracies. But there's also the fact that in people see the example that in Afghanistan and Iraq, there is such a strong, broad base of support for democracy after they were liberated from their tyrannical regimes, that also has an enormous inspirational effect throughout the area.
Thank you.
This gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Shay Haynes. I'm a senior at Harvard College. Well over the last decade, Chinese military spending has increased by over 10% a year. Currently, the Chinese People's Liberation Army has over 500 ballistic missiles aimed at the democratic island of Taiwan. President Bush has spent a lot of time recently voicing support and solidarity with democracies around the world. Why has this not translated into more support for the democratic island of Taiwan and more criticism for the world's largest and most powerful authoritarian nation, being People's Republic of China?
I think that we do support Taiwan. The president has made it clear our commitment to Taiwan's defense. Our goal with respect to China is that it not be our enemy. China is facing some big strategic choices. Essentially, what kind of world it wants to live in, which world it wants to live in. We would like to see China live in the world that we live in, the world of the advanced economies, the world of countries that have a concept of rules of the road in the international system. And I think if we can get to the point where the Chinese leaders see that their best future, their path to national greatness lies in the kind of economic opportunities they can provide their people by joining our world, and that the influence that they should be trying to exert over countries in their area should come from the excellent example of the kind of society they've created at home, then the people in China will be better off and the whole world will be better off. And I think that's the approach that we're taking in dealing with China and Taiwan.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Matt Downer. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College. What specific steps toward democracy would you like to see in the Middle East over the next 15 years? And perhaps in contrast, what steps do you think are most or less likely?
I mean, the steps that we'd like to see are steps taken by the people in the area to reform their own countries. And I mean, as much of a national interest as we have in the expansion of the community of democratic countries, it's not for us to be, as it were, imposing democracy on anybody. It's inherently self-contradictory to talk about ramming democracy down somebody's throat. The only way it can work is if democracy is chosen by people for themselves. Democracy is, in essence, self-government. People cannot be forced into self-government. They have to choose it. So the main thing I would say is what we would like to see are people in the area choosing to democratize their countries, because history shows they have an interest in that. As I said in my talk, there's a clear correlation between liberal democratic political institutions and freedom and prosperity. And we have an interest in it from our own point of view, because I think that our various interests in the world are better protected if we're living in a world where the rights of people are respected.
This man up here.
Hi, yeah, my name is Steven. I'm a sophomore at the college. Seems like there's been a lot of talk about, well, obviously there's been a lot of talk about the Middle East in your talk. But there's sort of this elephant in the room, which nobody ever really talks about, which is North Korea, which to me at least seems to be a really big problem. And I'm just wondering, like, what our strategy is right now to deal with that.
Beanbag, come on. Answer a real question.
Well, I thought that was a real question, so.
It's not, okay.
You can come down now. I mean, you're still sitting there, so I don't know what that's all about.
Phones have been rushed by the young Republicans. Do you want to take a real question?
Excuse me, I
The,
find it completely rude to do this to our guests. So if you have some sort of attitude problem, maybe you should leave and let our guests answer some appropriate questions.
Well, in the judgment that your question is real, I will try to answer it. North Korea is a big problem. I wouldn't describe it as a problem that nobody talks about. Depends what circles you travel in. The North Korean regime is absolutely one of the world's worst, and one of history's worst. It is pursuing a policy that is starving millions of North Koreans, and it is just awful. And it has impoverished the country. I mean, it's one of the things that's so remarkable is that if you look at the Korean Peninsula, in the north, it's the very same people that are in the south. But in the south, you have one of the world's most prosperous countries, and in the north, you have a completely impoverished country with mass starvation. What we are working to do to deal with the North Korean nuclear weapons program is we're working to get the various countries in the world that are most interested and have some leverage with North Korea, the Russians, the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Japanese, to work with us in what's called the six-party talks to try to get effective pressure on behalf of the international community to bear on North Korea to get it to change its policies. And this is something that is an interest not only of the United States, it's an interest of every country that cares about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example, and it is of a special interest to those countries that are in the immediate vicinity of North Korea. So we have some hope that there is enough interest there that the pressure that can be brought to bear will succeed. Thanks.
My name is Elaine Popoulias, and I direct the school's program on Southeastern Europe. I wanted to get your thoughts on the future of U.S.-Turkish relations. You have spent a good part of your career strengthening that bilateral relationship, formulating U.S. foreign policy towards Turkey. Do you see recent tensions between the two countries as an aberration or as some indication of a changing relationship? And would you join some in Washington who are raising cause for concern as what they see as growing anti-Americanism in Turkey?
Turkey is a long-standing, important ally of the United States, and we have both benefited, I think, greatly from our relationship, not only bilaterally, but our relationship within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We have had, in recent years, some serious problems with Turkey, and in particular over our differences, regarding our differences over Iraq. The Turkish government did not support our policy in Iraq. The Turkish people still don't like, according to the opinion polls, our policy in Iraq. And it's been a serious policy difference between us. As serious as it is, though, I think we retain a very large interest in preserving this relationship. I don't think there are very many countries in the world that have more to offer strategically than Turkey. And not simply because of its geographical location, but because Turkey is a stunning example of the earliest, largest, most long-standing, successful experiment in democracy in the Muslim world. And that is not a small thing. And that was not a small thing even during the Cold War. It is an even bigger thing in light of our interest in promoting democracy throughout the Muslim world, as you know, in the war on terrorism. So I think that we have an ongoing, extremely good and important relationship, a large interest in preserving it, notwithstanding the policy differences that we've had.
My name is Noah. I'm from the college. I'd like to thank you for coming, and I'd like to ask you about civil liberties, if I could, because you touched on that in your speech. People like Jose Padilla and Guantanamo Bay, you can always disagree over government interest and civil liberties and personal protections. I'd like to ask you about Lynn Stewart, who was recently sentenced guilty to 30 years in prison after defending, I believe, one of the perpetrators of the first World Trade Center attack. And who do you feel benefits from having a law that compromises lawyers and who they can work with and how they can work with them, and just information flow and security and privacy in terms of lawyers and their clients and civil liberties in America?
That's a good and serious question that is really out of my bailiwick. I think that's a question that would probably be more appropriate for a Justice Department person to field. I don't know much about the Stewart case, and so I mean it's hard for me to comment on it. I mean, as I said, I mean no disrespect by not offering you a substantive answer, but I don't know a lot about it, and it's not something I can shed a whole lot of light on.
Can you take any positions on civil liberties in America after 9/11 and the Patriot Act, maybe?
Well, I mean, I touched on that in my talk. the issues of how you balance the considerations of civil liberty and the considerations of public safety are hard issues. We have had the luxury, the good fortune to not have to do a lot of that balancing throughout our history. 9/11 forced us to think about, what are the measures that would make sense to help protect the country in light of the threat. I was not involved in the kinds of in the development of the legislation. That's not, as I said, that's not my field. I was involved in the thinking about what kind of strategy do we need to have in the war in order to minimize the pressure to trade civil liberties for safety. And that's why, as I said in the talk, that's why many of us thought that it was really indispensable to adopt a strategy that did not rely on defense, on hunkering down, on trying to prevent the next attack, at the border. And I think that's the closest I can come to dealing with that question.
Thank you. Go ahead. Up in the balcony.
Hi there. I'm Nate Ela. I'm a first-year student at the law school, and I was interested to hear you talking about Mill and Burke, and clearly you've thought a lot about political philosophers. I'd be interested in hearing what you have and what influence Leo Strauss and Carl Schmitt have played in your intellectual development, if any at all, because because Leo Strauss wrote that by defining a nation in contrast to another and saying that your nation is moral and the other is evil, you can help mobilize a population. Carl Schmitt said, sovereign is he who defines the exception. And it seems to me that the creation of a separate legal system based on an exception, based on President Bush saying there is an exception, it doesn't fall under the Geneva Conventions, and so I shouldn't be constrained by democratic rulemaking in that sphere. I'm interested in what comments you would have on that.
First of all, some of my best friends are Straussians. But I regret that I cannot say I am a student of his, or even a student of the students of his. I did not study with the Straussians. I can't say that I can claim enough knowledge of Leo Strauss to be able to tell you how I've profited from his work. He was a very smart guy. I have a minor familiarity with his work. But let me just hit one aspect of your question, which is touching on the Geneva Conventions, because that's something that I did have something to do with. My role, and I wrote about this in a piece that I published in the Wall Street Journal some months ago. My role when the issue arose of the status of the people that we captured in Afghanistan, in the fighting there. My thought at the time and my role was identifying the interest that I believe the United States has, and that the Department of Defense has in particular, in support for the Geneva Conventions. I don't think there is a country in the world that has a greater interest in promoting respect for the Geneva Conventions than the United States. We have our forces all over the world. We are one of the principal beneficiaries of the Geneva Conventions. And there is no institution in the US government that has a stronger interest in that than DOD. And that is what we argued when the issue came up of trying to think through quite a difficult question of the status of the people that were captured in Afghanistan. Now, the Geneva Conventions set up an incentive system. And it reflects actually a lot of wisdom on the part of the drafters in the late 40s of the Geneva Conventions. And the incentive system that they set up was basically this, that people who played by rules set out in the Geneva Conventions, and those rules were things like carrying arms openly, wearing uniforms, and complying with the laws of war. And that's a little oversimplification, but not much. People who obeyed those rules, which the Geneva Convention drafters wanted to encourage compliance with, would get rewarded by getting prisoner of war status and the various privileges that attend to that status if they got captured. And the Geneva Conventions set it up so that people who didn't comply with those rules would still be covered by the Geneva Conventions, but they were not entitled to prisoner of war status. Now, one thing that has happened in the debate about this subject is people have, I think, overly simplistically, and in a way that does not do justice to the Geneva Conventions or the seriousness of the whole subject, asserted that because the United States government did not grant prisoner of war status to the people we captured in Afghanistan, that we were showing disrespect for the Geneva Conventions. And I would argue that granting prisoner of war status in a way that undermines this intelligent incentive system built into the Geneva Conventions would in fact do harm to the Geneva Conventions. And I think that this administration did it right, notwithstanding the large amount of, I think, inaccurate and otherwise wrong-headed criticism that it's gotten for how it worked that issue. So I don't think that we should take a backseat to anybody in the support that we show for the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, as Shanti Renfrew of UMass, as an Indian and a person of people that were occupied for a long time, I'd like to thank you and President Bush for uniting the world against the English-speaking nations. And I think that the problem is the fallacious concept that if you can take out the secular governments and leave in the fundamentalist types and attempt to create a democracy in Iraq that is now more fundamentalist than it was before and closer to Iran, this seems like fallacious logic to me. And I think that because everyone knows that Israel has a hand in it, isn't this to Israel's detriment that they are a part of this axis? I mean, isn't this stupid in the world stage? I mean, what kind of idiot designed this program?
You're echoing views that are very common, that what resulted from the Iraqi elections was the success of a fundamentalist, pro-Iranian group. I don't think that that's accurate. I know it's common. I've heard it a lot. I think that it fails to understand who the Iraqis that won the election plurality are and what they say. The list that got the plurality was the list that is generally referred to as the Sistani list. And Ayatollah Sistani is an interesting person. And though he is a cleric, he made a number of very interesting statements over the years that he has been implementing, and we see that his actions are consistent with his statements. He believes in a separation of religion and state because of his concern for the damage that gets done to the religion by the kind of practices in Iran. The suggestion that the Sistani list people support the Iranian clerical model is wrong. And it is interesting that when the election campaign was underway in Iraq, Sistani and his people said that even though the top person on their list was a cleric, the prime minister should not be a cleric. And if you notice from the news reports, since that list won almost half the vote, there's no discussion of a cleric being the prime minister. It's also interesting that Sistani and his people have made the point, and they made the point before the elections, that even if the Sunni Arabs in Iraq were disinclined, intimidated from participating in the elections, it would be important to include them in the government and in the constitution drafting process. This is, I think, an extremely sophisticated point that they made. And I think it basically reflects that a lot of people in Iraq understand that there are not that many choices for the Iraqi people. One choice is a return to tyranny, not very popular. Another choice is civil war, also not very popular. Arguably, the only alternative to tyranny or civil war is some kind of political system in which power is shared. And that has given rise to a politics that is beginning to show this signs of a culture of compromise that I referred to before as one of the key building blocks of democracy. So I think it is a calumny to say what you said about the people who won the election in Iraq.
We have time for two more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Gustavo Espada. I'm a Harvard College graduate from 1996. You talked in your speech tonight about trust and openness a few times. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence when they released a report analyzing the failure of our pre-war intelligence, mainly about the links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which your Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon was supposedly responsible for. I have a section of the report that I could download from the internet, and the section actually on your work is blacked out really quite a bit. I mean, this is my favorite page right here. But Senator Levin subsequently launched an investigation to really get to the bottom of what was going on in your office. And he was quoted as saying that you had practiced a continuing deception of Congress. So it seems that the failures of your office are being hidden from the American people, and yet you're asking us to believe you when you talk to us about the threat of terrorism, these shadowy groups, these conspiracies against America. Most of them, if you judge by the 9/11 report, seem to be based on testimony from one man, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, whose credibility is, who knows how we interrogated him. Yes, the question is, how can the American people trust you?
Well, Senator Levin and I have differences on a number of issues and conclusions that he's come to, including the one that you read, and that's life in Washington. As for the Senate Intelligence Committee report, I mean, I, to be sure, I'm not responsible for the fact that they classified paragraphs in their report, and that's why they're blacked out in the public version of the report. So, that's up to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and I didn't write that report. But what I can, what I would call your attention to is there is a great deal in that report that was released to the public that is unclassified, and the conclusion of it was, specifically with regard to what you talked about, which was the work that was done in my office regarding the Iraq Al-Qaeda connection. What that report said is that it looked at the question of whether anybody in the government, in my office or elsewhere, had brought undue pressure to bear on intelligence analysts to politicize their work. It talked about the fact that the Intelligence Committee interviewed hundreds of analysts and put out the word that it wanted anybody who had a story of pressure to come forward and tell it. And it concluded that there was not only not a systematic effort to pressure, there was not a single intelligence analyst who said that he was pressured into changing his conclusions. So, in fact, that report gave a completely clean bill of health on the issue of whether anybody in the administration pressured. Hang on one second. You made some serious comments. Please permit me to comment. The other thing that report did is it did look at interactions between my office and the intelligence community. And what it said is those interactions were professional, they were correct, and furthermore, they were useful. And there's a line in there to the effect that the kinds of questioning that were done about the quality of the intelligence community's work on this subject improved the product of the intelligence community. So I would be delighted to have all of you read what you can download from the internet as the Senate Intelligence Committee report on that work. Some of it is classified and blacked out. I believe hundreds of pages are not. And I would welcome you. I would welcome the scrutiny of all of you of that document.
Last question.
My name is Vivek Shinde-Patil. I'm a research fellow at the Harvard Medical School. My support for the war in Iraq has always provoked and generated a lot of conversation with most of my friends. One of the questions I can never answer that they ask me is, which I'm going to pose to you, sir, because it always confounds me. If indeed this spread of democracy, and it's really remarkable, some of the fledglings of democracy in the Middle East right now, if indeed that this is really what is happening, and it's so remarkable, why wasn't this the primary reason for going to war with Iraq? Why didn't we say that we want to support democracy rather than use the weapons of mass destruction? Is it because it was a better sell? I'm not sure. I'd appreciate your comments on this.
That is an important question. And no, it is a very important question because it I think affects lots of people's view of what it is that has happened in Iraq and whether it's a success, to judge it against what was set out as the strategic rationale for the war. I believe that, well, I know that the strategic rationale for the war, as I saw it and most of my colleagues in the government saw it, was a range of ideas. And in fact, we even had a mnemonic, WMD and the 3 T's, okay? And it was the danger of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, threats to neighbors, and tyranny. And that's how we thought of it. And I believe there are statements that I believe there are ample statements by various administration officials from which one could clearly, extract that broad range of considerations as being relevant to the rationale for the war. It is true that the path that we took diplomatically for dealing with the Iraq problem was the UN path. And President Bush chose to bring the Iraq issue to the UN in September of 2002. He made his speech to the General Assembly. That was the first major speech saying that we've got to deal with this problem. He called on the UN to work the issue. He said it was a challenge for the UN. We worked it. We produced, through our government's efforts, the Resolution 1441. And the UN was focused on the inspection regime and the weapons of mass destruction issue that had been the subject of a long string of UN resolutions. And the public debate about the whole rationale for the war wound up focusing largely on the weapons of mass destruction issue, as you point out. And what I would say is that as true as that is, and as much emphasis as that issue got, I believe the actual strategic rationale for the war, which was explained in various statements, although I do admit there was an enormous and arguably inordinate emphasis on the WMD issue. But the true rationale for the war did encompass all those elements. And I mean, the fundamental point was that all of the things that made people concerned about Iraq throughout the 1990s, before 9/11, all of the things that concerned us about the Iraqi threat to its neighbors, its history of aggression, its hostility to us, its support for terrorism, all of those things, which led Congress in 1998 to pass the Iraq Liberation Act years before 9/11, all of those things re-examined in light of 9/11 represented in the view of the president an inordinate danger to the United States. In light of 9/11, the danger that a guy like Saddam Hussein could provide the fruits of his WMD programs to terrorists was simply an unacceptable danger. And I think that was the actual rationale for the war, and it did encompass these other elements, although, as I said, I think there was a great emphasis on the WMD issue, and in retrospect, one thinks it would have been better to have a more balanced discussion of all the elements.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I thank our guests for coming.